A couple of days here. It's not your first visit to Sri Lanka, and I'm sure that whatever news trickles to India from our travels down here, particularly this year, you're no stranger to what we've gone through. You spoke about the construction of a country and not its destruction. One could argue that we are now talking in Sri Lanka about the construction of a new country after its destruction. The resistance is significant. And I'm sorry to keep coming back to this, but as no stranger to the dynamics in Sri Lanka, what gives you most hope that there is a possibility of the introduction of RTI?
You know, I think Sri Lanka, for us
Yes.
who sit on the other side, has always been notionally a free country. So I have to, sort of knock my head to understand that there are problems of this sort in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
Never imagined it before.
Yeah.
So I think the basic structure of Sri Lankan society is liberal. The basic structure of Sri Lankan society is democratic. And if fear has made it become undemocratic and become constricted in its thinking, I think this is the time for release. And the youth play a very important role. They have to understand, and also elderly people who have seen older Sri Lanka have to play an important role to get it back to a state of health. And right to information, therefore, is vitally important because it speaks of open governance.
One other, I want to slightly shift focus here because you have significant, a wealth of lived experience in rural India. An India which I have been fortunate to see, but very few actually have lived in to the extent that you have, and even acknowledge in the India of one's imagination. With regard to Sri Lanka as well, part of the criticism with a framework for economic empowerment and development that came at the height of what was called the ceasefire agreement, the CFA, or the peace process, or the peace of the former government, was called the Regaining Sri Lanka framework, and it was very neoliberal. It was economic development over everything else. It was not rights-based, and it certainly did not in the least acknowledge agrarian development. It raised quite a number of questions as to how sustainable and how just such a framework for economic development for Sri Lanka would be. Now, in terms of rural development, real meaningful empowerment, India has made strides in that regard as well. And what lessons can your experiences with such processes offer to countries like ours, but also a wider global audience?
Well, if you look at India, for instance, in the last 15 years, we've gone through lots of upheavals back and forth in our economic agenda. It's very strange that a government which also insisted on opening up and liberalization economically should have also given us the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act.
Sure. Now, what is that actually?
The National Rural Employment Guarantee Act is a guarantee that the state gives you, that they'll give you 100 days of employment for every poor household. For every household in the rural areas, not poor, every household.
Every household.
Provided, A, there's a demand for work, and that you're willing to do manual work, and that you'll work those 8 hours a day, and you will get what is called official minimum wages for that particular day. It has made a sea change in India because for the first time migration is stopped, distress migration is stopped. For the first time women are staying home, local councils are beginning to work, all the social development indicators are going up because employment is the basis for dignity. Employment is the basis for all building of all economic hope. And because it's demand driven, it doesn't mean that you give it per se. People have to demand and then you give it to them. And it is a guarantee because if you don't give it to them in 15 days, the government has to pay an unemployment allowance to the workers asked for work. So it pulls up the machinery, the delivery mechanism, which has always failed in India. It's been corrupt, inefficient, etc. So the fear of that also has pulled them up. But the most important thing is it has transparency provisions. The RTI was passed before the NREGA. So the right to information provisions are there. Mandatory transparency of all information relating to the NREGA at the village level and a social or public audit of the accounts.
Conducted at
the
village
village level.
At the village level.
At the village level.
Right. Yeah.
So every worker has a right to see all the accounts, collectively or individually. Anyone actually, any citizen can see it.
Both with what you just said and also with the RTI examples that you offered, it seems to be the case that India is actually at all its levels of civil service keen to address its shortcomings, in the sense that if a public reports something, there is that perhaps the initial resistance, but then there is a cautious engagement leading up to actual redressal. Now, you're smiling now. That might not always be the case, but it certainly, I mean, it occurred to me that that seems to be the majority of
No, I wouldn't say that.
You wouldn't say that. So then correct me. It's still not as rosy
no,
as
actually, the
as you
Rural
said.
Employment Guarantee Act and the demand for it
Yeah.
was created over the years. It's an old demand.
Right.
It's been, we were also involved in its present phase in a major way, but it's an old demand. And the government had enacted a Maharashtra Employment Guarantee Scheme
Right.
25 years ago in Maharashtra. So it was based on an older admittance that state had a responsibility. But in the coming together of this, it became a democratic embarrassment to any party to say they wouldn't give employment to the very poor when they ask for votes. So we've linked it to the to electoral politics in a way. And what they didn't expect and we were hopeful for, this last election has proved that if you really meet the genuine demands of people, they vote for you without booth capturing, without violence, without intimidation. And this government has come back in a large measure due to NREGA and RTI. The two acts that they were most afraid of because they thought they would lose, because it exposes corruption, it exposes inefficiencies.
Has corruption gone down, or is it too early
Well,
yet?
the Transparency International says it's gone down.
Right. Transactional corruption.
Transactional corruption has gone down.
Right.
And otherwise too, there's a fear now because we can see anything. And we have seen
And your
policies.
media is using this?
Media is using it and reporting on it.
Sure.
More reporting on it than using it. Because now just by going
Reporting
there,
on the legislation.
reporting on use of it.
Oh, on the right.
On the channels. For instance, 6 months after they gave us the act, they wanted to amend it in 2006.
Yeah.
All the channels, the TV channels, are daily programs. And there was voting in, you know, whether you wanted it amended or not, continually. And no one wanted the act amended. So it was against public opinion. So the political parties were also wary. There was political pressure. There were multiple things that happened. But one very important thing was media involvement. But they've been with us in the struggle for RTI.
Earlier this year we had a literary festival called the Goa Literary Festival, and we had the Tarun Tejpal come here and do a wonderful set of presentations, as he is wont to do. Also launched his new book. But he did say something very interesting that stuck in my mind. He said Teherka, when Kargil was on, took a conscious decision to not question the Indian state's actions in that regard. But when it was over, they decided to take it on. Now, raised some questions amongst journalists who also listened in to what he said, because in Sri Lanka we have felt that it is important to hold government accountable even during war. Not just this government, but in a wider sense, any government, especially during war, because that is when the most egregious abuses of governance occur. What do you feel would be your take on Tarun's comment?
See, actually, I think one will have to grow into a total transparency, where when even the decision to go into war.
Do you think it's possible?
One day, why not?
Yeah.
See, 12 years ago or 13 years ago, when we were sitting agitating for right to information, a very important person in India, Lakshmi Jain, wrote me a letter saying that, Aruna, this is not going to happen in your lifetime. You fight for it. A lawyer in Biawar came and told me, carry on fighting, but you are going to lose. There's no chance of winning. So we said, well, never mind. It's a good cause, so we'll fight. I said, why do you think we'll lose? He said, you're asking a rotten system to tear its heart out and place it out.
Very Shakespearean.
You will fail, he said, in our language.
Yes.
In Hindi, he said. But we got the law. We got the NREGA. I think ultimately, I'll go and quote Eduardo Galeano, that for a good democracy, you need common sense and wisdom. And I think in all our people, it's there in plenty. So if we start looking away from those small pools of so-called intelligentsia and so-called intellectuals and so-called people who determine policy, to the large numbers of people who have common sense, there should be a way out, because they will and they will not get... See, we create jingoism. So if we don't create jingoism,